For many Northerners, the struggle over the Kansas Constitution also illustrated this point. A large majority of voters in this territory were opposed to slavery, but they had been unable to gain entry into the Union as a free state. The Topeka Constitution, which barred slavery, had been rejected by Congress in 1856. A pro-slavery territorial government had responded by creating the Lecompton Constitution. Although decisively rejected by Kansas voters in a referendum held in January of 1858, the document was still forwarded to the national government for ratification. President Buchanan, a Northern Democrat with strong Southern sympathies, tried to ram the pro-slavery Constitution through Congress. He succeeded in securing enough votes in the Senate, but the House of Representatives balked, in part because of the efforts of another Northern Democrat, Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois. Douglas told his colleagues that he would not vote to, quote, force this Constitution down the throats of the people of Kansas in opposition to their wishes, unquote. Douglas's actions inflamed the growing division within the Democratic Party between its Southern and Northern wings, a division that would help ensure a Republican victory in 1860. Douglas also ironically played a key role in making Abraham Lincoln a national figure. Lincoln had served one term as a U.S. congressman in the 1840s, then retired to the private sector to become a successful corporate lawyer. In 1858, however, he was selected by the Republican Party in Illinois to run for the Senate seat held by Douglas. The rivals staged a series of debates throughout the state that clearly set forth Lincoln's political philosophy. Lincoln argued, quote, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it and place it where the public mind shall rest in the belief that is in the course of ultimate extinction, or its advocates will push it forward till it shall become alike lawful in all the states, old as well as new, North as well as South." Lincoln here was not calling for the immediate abolition of slavery, but he did suggest that by stopping its spread to the territories, this institution would be unable to survive, that over time it would fade away and the entire country would become free. At the same time, he was warning that the slaveocracy would not rest until they had perverted the Constitution to allow slavery everywhere in the country. He pointed to the Dred Scott decision as a key step in this direction. Pressed by Douglas, who sought to paint him as an abolitionist, Lincoln refused to endorse the idea of full social and political equality for African Americans. His cautious approach was designed to appeal to the general political views of most Northerners. They saw slavery as a moral blight and a threat to their opportunities in the Western territories, but they were still rather racist and unwilling to accept blacks as equals. Lincoln was also able to force his opponent into a corner by pointing out that the Dred Scott decision had essentially nullified the doctrine of popular sovereignty, the device that Douglas had used to justify the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Douglas responded with what became known as the Freeport Doctrine, that despite Dred Scott, territorial governments could bar slavery simply by not passing laws to protect it, such as slave codes. Without these codes, he argued, slavery could not exist. Ultimately, Lincoln failed to secure the Senate seat, but by taking the stage against a key national figure, he had gained widespread recognition as a champion of the Republican cause. Moreover, Douglas's articulation of the Freeport Doctrine had further weakened the Democrats. Douglas had already alienated many Southerners with his refusal to endorse the pro-slavery Lecompton Constitution. His end run around the Dred Scott decision infuriated them even more, ensuring that he would receive little Southern support when he ran for the presidency in 1860. From the Southern perspective, the trend in national politics was becoming increasingly alarming. The failure of Kansas to become a slave state, the stubborn refusal of Northern politicians to accept the Dred Scott decision, and the increasingly strident rhetoric of abolitionists signaled to them that the North was dead set on destroying slavery, regardless of what the South wanted, or the Constitution said. This threat was compounded by the simple fact that the slave states were rapidly losing their political power in the national government. In part because of surging immigration, the voting population of the North far exceeded that of the South by the 1850s. Southern Democrats had retained some power by strategic alliances with Northern Democrats, but the growing controversy of the territories had fractured this coalition. The events leading up to the election of 1860 further heightened Southern fears. On the night of October 16, 1859, the radical abolitionist John Brown led 22 men in an attack on the Federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Brown planned to use the weapons from the arsenal to stage a massive slave insurrection in the South. The raid failed, and Brown was captured by Federal troops. The trial which followed electrified the nation. While most Northerners condemned Brown's violent tactics, some endorsed his actions. Ralph Waldo Emerson called Brown, quote, "a new saint who will make the gallows glorious like the cross," unquote, while Henry David Thoreau compared him to Christ and called him, quote, "an angel of light," unquote. Southern suspicion and fury became even greater when it was revealed that Brown's enterprise had been financed by several prominent New England abolitionists. Increasingly, the South lost the ability to distinguish between those, like Lincoln, who were opposed to slavery but willing to see it continue in its existing territory, and those like Brown who wished to see the entire system expire in an orgy of blood. The fact that Brown's trial and ultimate execution took place less than a year before the presidential elections ensured that this viewpoint was foremost in the mind of Southerners. When the Democratic National Party gathered to select its presidential candidate in 1860, the issue of slavery shattered its unity. Southern Democrats insisted that the party include in its platform a demand for a law that would protect the rights of slaveholders in the territories. When Northern delegates rejected this measure, the Southern delegates left the convention. Unable to reconcile their differences, Northern and Southern Democrats nominated separate candidates for the presidency. Complicating matters even further was the creation of the Constitutional Union Party, founded by former Southern Whigs. In the election that followed, the Republican candidate, Abraham Lincoln, easily won a majority of the Electoral College vote. His victory demonstrated the overwhelming power of the North, since no Southern state had supported him. Indeed, his name did not even appear on the ballot in most of these states. While Lincoln was considered a moderate on the slavery issue, he did firmly support the Republican Party platform of halting the expansion of slavery into the territories, a proposal that the Southern states found completely unacceptable. The Deep South, the region most relied upon slavery, reacted violently to the Republican victory. With South Carolina leading the way, they seceded from the Union and formed the Confederacy. The remaining slave states hesitated. Hoping that the rebel states would voluntarily return to the Union, Lincoln promised in his inaugural speech that he would not touch the institution of slavery where it already existed, and that he would not initiate the use of force to resolve the crisis. At the same time, he firmly denounced secession as illegal, and he vowed to maintain control over federal property. It was this last issue that helped spark the outbreak of war. Throughout the country, the states had given land to the federal government, typically for military institutions. While the seceding states insisted that this property had reverted to them when they left the Union, Lincoln disagreed. The conflict became particularly intense over a federal fort in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, Fort Sumter. With the fort running short on supplies, Lincoln realized that he had to either send provisions or withdraw the troops. He decided to send in a supply ship, being careful to first notify the rebel government that the vessel contained only provisions, not arms or reinforcements. Nonetheless, South Carolina chose to interpret this as an act of war, and rather than prolong its siege of the facility, they decided to take it by force. On April 12, 1861, rebel forces began firing upon Fort Sumter. 2 days later, his situation hopeless, the Union commander withdrew his troops. Lincoln immediately called for 75,000 volunteer soldiers to put down the rebellion. With the dispute now degenerating into violence, several of the hesitant border states decided to throw in with the Confederacy, rather than see their fellow slave states subdued by force. The war had begun.